But I want to start with something that came out in May. In mid-May, Time magazine published a big story about one prong of the Russian attack on the U.S. election last year. As we've been talking about, that effort really had three prongs, three different components. First, there was the straight-up hacking effort by Russia to try to penetrate local and state election systems all over the country, mostly targeting voter registration rolls. We still don't have a clear sense of why they did that, what they did with the access that they gained through that attack, what they were trying to do, whether that might have been laying the groundwork for something in the future. I'll say, just personally, I find it mildly distressing that under the Trump administration, the Department of Homeland Security doesn't seem overly interested in investigating what the consequences were of that hacking attack and whether U.S. election systems might be compromised in a way because of that attack that we may not learn about until that effect is sort of actuated sometime in the future. But that pure hacking effort going after state and local elections software and elections infrastructure, that was the first part of the Russian attack. Second prong of the attack was their attack on political institutions, specifically the Democratic National Committee, the Clinton campaign. This is where Russian hackers stole information off of American servers. And then, unlike a normal spying operation where the Russians would keep those documents, keep those secrets for themselves so the Russian government could use that information to inform its own actions. Instead, they took that information, they repackaged it, and then they fed it back to us. They fed it back to the American public in a way that was designed to do maximum damage to one presidential candidate, Hillary Clinton, and to provide maximum benefit to another, Donald Trump. So that was the second prong. First was the attack on the election infrastructure. Second was the stealing stuff and repackaging it and sending that stuff they stole back at the American public. The third prong of their three-prong attack was what they did on social media and in media. The manipulation of news and online discussion of news and the interrupting and steering of social media traffic to, again, hurt one candidate in the presidential election, Hillary Clinton, and to help their preferred candidate, Donald Trump. In mid-May, Time magazine did a big deep dive into that last prong of the Russian attack, the social media part of it. It's a fascinating report. It's a really good article. The report was written by Massimo Calabresi, who's a very good reporter. It's very well written. You might remember that was the issue of Time magazine where they put this image on the cover where the White House was slowly morphing into the Kremlin. Well, deep into that story, Massimo Calabresi had this great new detail that didn't get a ton of attention when that story came out. But looking back now, it's clear that it should have. He reported in mid-May in Time magazine that there had been an intelligence intercept, a U.S. intelligence intercept that happened last spring in May of 2016, where U.S. intelligence overheard a conversation that took place in Russia between two Russian officials. And they were talking about a Russian plan to, quote, cause chaos in last year's presidential election. What they were talking about was a Russian plan to try to hurt Hillary Clinton in the presidential election last year by using Russian assets, Russian resources directed by the Kremlin to manipulate the American public's view of Hillary Clinton by spreading damaging information about Hillary Clinton through the resources of the Russian military intelligence service, through the GRU. So that intelligence intercept about that conversation overheard between Russian officials in May 2016, that was initially reported in May 2017, May 2017 this year, by Time magazine. That report about that U.S. intelligence intercept, overhearing those two Russian officials talking to each other, that was re-upped today by Peter Stone and Greg Gordon reporting at McClatchy. Quote, as Donald Trump was locking up the Republican presidential nomination in May 2016, a U.S. intelligence intercept picked up Russians discussing ways to spread news damaging to Hillary Clinton. McClatchy citing two people familiar with the matter. So that May 2016 intelligence intercept, which has now been reported by Time magazine and by McClatchy, where the Russians are talking about how to manipulate American news about Hillary Clinton. The importance of that is now way more recognizable than when we first learned about it. And it's way more recognizably important because of its timing, right? If that discussion between those Russian officials happened in May 2016, we now know what happened next, right? In June 2016, in early June 2016, was that previously undisclosed meeting between Donald Trump Jr., Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort, and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. At Trump Tower, they're meeting with an emissary from the Russian government, a lawyer who was Russian-speaking, who brought a translator with her, who got that meeting in Trump Tower with the top echelon of the Trump campaign, because she apparently was seen by them as the delivery agent to the Trump campaign of official Russian government documents and information that would somehow incriminate Hillary Clinton and that the Trump folks could use in the campaign against her. Now, since the emails setting up that meeting were disclosed by Donald Trump Jr. yesterday morning, a lot of people have noted that Mr. Trump didn't seem surprised. He didn't seem taken aback at all when he was told bluntly in this email asking for this meeting that this, quote, obviously very high level and sensitive information is part of Russia and its government's support for Mr. Trump. We have the whole email chain, at least what Donald Trump Jr. says is the whole email chain. And he doesn't respond to that by saying, you know, wait, Russia and its government are supporting Mr. Trump? He doesn't seem shocked, right? He doesn't say this is part of how Russia and its government are supporting Mr. Trump. What are the other parts? What are the other ways in which they're helping, right? He doesn't react with surprise. He doesn't seem at all taken aback to hear about this promised delivery of Hillary Clinton dirt from this emissary from the Russian government. He doesn't seem surprised to hear that this is part of the Russian government supporting his father in the election. So it didn't surprise Donald Trump Jr., nor does this apparent involvement of the Russian government in our election apparently surprise or bother Paul Manafort or Jared Kushner. It doesn't bother them enough to keep them from taking the meeting, even though they were informed about what it was. Well, looking back on that, for context now, we know that the Russian attack was well underway by that time, right? This wasn't the start of it. Russian intelligence officials the previous month, in May 2016, had been caught on tape, caught on a U.S. intelligence intercept, talking about the Russian plan to spread damaging news about Hillary Clinton in order to help Trump's prospects in the campaign. So that discussion was in May, that meeting was in June. Since we learned about the scale and the impact of the Russian attack to try to manipulate social media and the news media in this country, there has been I think there have been a lot of serious questions raised as to whether or not the Russians could have pulled off that attack as well as they did without any domestic help, without somebody in America helping them do it most effectively. There have been serious questions raised as to whether somebody in the U.S. might have had to help them in their efforts in terms of which groups of American voters to target, what messages were expected to work, how they might be able to dovetail their media manipulation with what the Trump campaign was doing at that time to try to hurt Hillary Clinton on their own terms. There have been a lot of questions about that ever since we realized the scope of what Russia did with its social media targeting, right? Well, McClatchy reports today that investigators in both the House Intelligence Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee, as well as investigators at the Department of Justice, they're now looking at that. They're now looking specifically at whether or not the digital operation of the Trump campaign itself might have been the entity that helped the Russians in that part of their attack. Whether the digital aspect of the Trump campaign is part of what helped the Russians target their news media manipulation and the stuff they did via social media. Greg Gordon is one of the two McClatchy reporters who is on that story today. We're going to be speaking with Greg Gordon live about that story in just a few minutes tonight. I should also tell you that for that story, McClatchy spoke with a former Pentagon official, an official who just left the Defense Department in January after serving there as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine and Eurasia. That senior Pentagon official responsible for Russia now says about that part of the Russia attack last year, quote, there appears to have been significant cooperation between Russia's online propaganda machine and individuals in the United States who were knowledgeable about where to target the disinformation. Again, that coming from the person who was in charge of Russia at the Pentagon at the time the Russian attack was happening. We are going to be speaking with that former official that former Pentagon official tomorrow night on this program for the interview. So you should cancel your Thursday night plans right now. So all that is stacked up. That headline from McClatchy today is presumably harrowing to the Trump White House. Trump-Russia investigators probe Jared Kushner-run digital operation, because he was in charge of digital at the Trump campaign. But even after that, late this evening, that particular story became even worse news for the Trump White House, because later this evening, Charlie Savage from the New York Times reported on a new lawsuit that has just been filed down to the wire, just inside the statute of limitations. It's a lawsuit filed by donors to the Democratic Party and one DNC staffer. What they're doing is they're suing the Trump campaign. This is a lawsuit that has been filed by an organization that was formed very recently by former Obama administration lawyers. It's an organization called Protect Democracy. I'm sort of watching them to see what they would do. Now they have filed this lawsuit against the Trump campaign, alleging that while it might have been Russian government hackers who broke into the DNC and stole DNC information in the first place, this lawsuit alleges that it was actually the Trump campaign that conspired to release the information back to the American public. This is actually an invasion of privacy lawsuit, because the personal information of those donors and DNC staffers was released to the public, along with all that other stuff and that targeted data dump of DNC stuff, which, again, this lawsuit says was not just a Russian operation. It was a Russian operation in which the Trump campaign conspired. So we have posted a link to the complaint that has been filed in this lawsuit in federal district court in D.C., if only because if you've been trying to keep track of the known universe of facts and data and documents that have been produced in the Trump-Russia investigation thus far, this lawsuit may be a whole new source of emails, texts, phone records, other primary source documents. Through this discovery process in this lawsuit, they want to depose witnesses, they want campaign documents. Again, this is specifically looking at whether there was Trump campaign involvement in what has otherwise been seen as a Russian operation. So, and I should mention that the lawyers involved in this, the people who are suing the Trump campaign here, are freaking highfalutin, high-powered people who know what they are doing. So there's that. I mean, if you think about this from the perspective of the Trump White House, you think about the perspective from like their lawyers, their legal team, the people who are trying to defend the president and defend Trump campaign people on the Trump-Russia affair, just on that issue. They're now dealing with the special counsel Robert Mueller investigation. They're dealing with the Senate Judiciary Committee looking at possible obstruction of justice. They're looking at the Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committee, both broadly looking at the question of the Russian attack and potential Trump campaign collusion in that attack. Now, in addition to that, they are looking at what may be a very high-powered offensive through the court system, through the federal courts, all tied to that second prong of the Russian attack, that hack of the DNC where they stole that information and turned it back on the American people. Imagine trying to manage the defense on all of those fronts. The guy who's supposedly the captain of that team managing the defense is Mark Kasowitz, who is the New York lawyer who had previously represented Donald Trump in his business interests and his divorces and stuff. That's who Trump brought to Washington to run his Russia defense. Mark Kasowitz is not the only lawyer involved in that defense, but he is supposed to be in charge of the team. Well, today, the New York Times reports that Mark Kasowitz is considering resigning. ProPublica has also today published an enormous, hair-curling story about Mark Kasowitz today, which is part personal profile, but also part cliffhanger in terms of whether or not Mark Kasowitz is going to be able to continue in his role leading the Trump defense. And even if he does stay on and he doesn't resign, they're raising the question as to whether he can continue to effectively run this defense. We have posted this ProPublica story on our website as well tonight. It's long. It's fascinating if you are interested in this side of the story. I should tell you, though, it's got a lot of disparaging personal information about Mr. Kasowitz, including stuff like about his lifestyle and even medical issues for him. It's got a lot of details about, I kid you not, his behavior at office Christmas parties. I mean, it's It is an unusual thing. There are some unnamed sources in the piece, but there are a lot of named sources as well, including named sources who are people close to the president. So I don't have that much appetite for learning about the palace intrigue in terms of who likes who and who's on the outs and what's happening among the people who work for the president on personal terms. But between this New York Times reporting that the president's top Russia lawyer might resign and this incredibly well-reported litany of negative personal information that was just published in this big story about him at ProPublica with this very damning sourcing, that's just, whether or not you care about the personalities involved here, that is starting to become a factor that we ought to pay attention to in terms of whether or not the president really is getting an adequate defense as this scandal gets more intense. He picked a weird defense team anyway when it comes to defending from a Washington scandal, but the guy in charge of it, if he's about to quit and now facing this barrage, that's a factor. And it's not just the president's legal team that's starting to look a little wobbly. There are also signs of stress among very high-ranking White House officials, including Vice President Mike Pence, whose spokesman today had a very hard time refusing to answer questions about Mike Pence's own contacts with Russian officials during the campaign. We will be talking about that a little later on today. As for Jared Kushner, the only currently serving White House official who was at that June meeting last year with the Russian lawyer at Trump Tower, Jared Kushner, he's facing pointed questions today from, among others, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, asking why, for months now, Jared Kushner has allowed the White House, including White House spokespeople and Vice President Mike Pence and senior advisors like Kellyanne Conway, why he has allowed all of these people around him to insist publicly for months that there were definitely no meetings with Russian officials during the campaign, when Jared Kushner knew there had been, because in at least one case, he was at that meeting. I mean, allowing other White House officials, including Vice President Mike Pence, to make false statements about whether or not there were contacts with Russians, right? I mean, isn't that what Mike Flynn was ostensibly fired for? So Jared Kushner is facing serious questions tonight about why he stood by and allowed the White House and senior White House officials to repeatedly lie about something he had firsthand information about. He's also facing serious questions about whether or not he should lose his security clearance, which allows him to operate in his job as a White House senior advisor. We'll be talking more about that tonight as well. Among the president's defenders in Congress, things there are also starting to get a little shaky, although in this case, I think the shaking might just be like an egg that's about to hatch. I think it might just be a predicate to what we are about to see that I expect to be a large-scale political counteroffensive by Republicans and the conservative media to try to turn this scandal into something else that is not about President Trump. Today was the Senate confirmation hearing for Christopher Wray, who's the Trump administration's nominee to be the new head of the FBI. The chairman of the committee that conducted that confirmation hearing is Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa. Somewhat strangely, although I did say to watch for this last night, somewhat strangely today, Senator Grassley spent a good portion of his opening statement in this confirmation hearing today going after the current acting director of the FBI, going after Andrew McCabe, and saying he wants Andrew McCabe off of any investigation involving Mike Flynn. The chairman preceded today's very important hearing for the FBI director by also going on Fox and Friends and entertaining their questions about whether the Russian lawyer meeting with Don Jr. in Trump Tower was all a Democratic Party setup. And he bragged to them about how that dossier of alleged Russian dirt on Donald Trump needs to be investigated, not investigated to figure out whether or not it's true and based in reality, but its existence needs to be investigated because maybe the existence of that dossier is the real scandal here, and the Russia lawyer was maybe a setup, and Fusion GPS, who paid for that dossier, maybe they're the supervillain here and they did it and Russia didn't. So in Trump world, things are a little wobbly right now. The Trump legal team has some significant personnel wobbles to it. Trump administration senior officials up to and including the vice president are having their own troubles with this story because nepotism is apparently normal now. The troubles at the upper echelons of the Trump administration also include troubles for the Trump family, particularly for the Trump's son-in-law and Trump's eldest son. who may both be facing serious legal questions about their behavior. That's been reported over the last couple of days. Also, among Trump-supporting Republicans in Congress, I continue to stick a flag there. The flag I stuck there last night is still waving in terms of an expected counterattack trying to turn this into a Democratic scandal. That effort to try to turn this into a Democratic scandal, it is happening already almost full scale in the conservative media. The president started tweeting some of those articles from the conservative media today. Republican members of Congress, including senior Republican senators like Chuck Grassley, are starting to use those talking points and point in that direction. It is coming. And into all of that, into all of those different places where we can see the panic button getting hit, into all of that comes a big new scoop today from the Wall Street Journal, from national security reporter Shane Harris. And that story's next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.